Good afternoon and welcome to this Global Fleet Champions webinar on tackling drug driving, sponsored by D.tec International. Drivers who are impaired by drugs, whether illegal or prescription, are never fit to be in control of a vehicle. Any drug driver presents a serious risk to your fleet's safety and reputation, and is a danger to other road users. Robust drug policies and procedures are vital for ensuring all your employees are safe to be behind the wheel. In this webinar, we will discuss the risk that drug driving poses to your organization, how different drugs affect driving, the importance of testing in the workplace, and the policies and procedures that can help you tackle drug driving. Today's webinar will be a slightly different format to previous events we've done in that we are running it as a live event. The speakers are all here today on the web, sharing their webcams, and we'll be presenting to you live. You can still submit any questions you have using the questions function on the right-hand side of your screen, and question and answer sessions will be held periodically throughout the webinar. I will now hand you over to Andrew Drewary from Road Safety Smart, who will be presenting today's event.
Thank you, Adam. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you will enjoy what we've got for you today. A very informative session, as Adam said, slightly different to the usual format. And we've got three short presentations today, one from myself looking at identifying some of the issues as drug drivers from an investigative perspective and what employees should be looking out for. We've got a session from Lewin at D.tec looking at the solutions and some facts and figures around drink and drug driving, particularly in the UK at the minute. I am aware that we do have a number of international attendees today, so we will touch on a few things that cover right across the board. And then final presentation we've got from Lesley O'Brien at FreightLink Europe to give an operator's perspective from a drink and drive issues that she has to deal with on a daily basis, and some of the testing processes that she has put in place. Feel free to ask questions in the question box as we go through the sessions. Happy to try and answer any questions that we have as we go through the session to make it topical at the time. And if there's any left at the end of the session, we'll do a mock-up session between ourselves. Three presenters today have sort of worked together previously, and we'll probably ask each other questions as well about our own different presentations as we go through. So just to start with, Ian, if you would just like to do a brief introduction, please.
Good afternoon. My name's Ian Lewin. I'm the Managing Director of D.tec International. We've been around specifically in this drink and drug driving issue for 25 years. A lot of that time was spent introducing or helping government introduce the Section 5A above the limit for the drug driving legislation. This has greatly assisted the traffic police in their creation of a suitable deterrent. I've spent a lot of time in this industry. I know the answer to an awful lot of questions, but I also know when to ask some specialists again. So as Andrew said, if there's any questions you want to ask, you can ask them in this forum or contact us afterwards on the contact details.
Thank you, Ian. Lesley, please, brief introduction.
Hello, everybody. My name's Lesley O'Brien, and I'm Director at FreightLink Europe. I have over 40 years experience working in the transport industry, both national and international. And I have to say, never before has this issue of drink and drug driving been more important. So I will be giving you my experience of implementing systems.
I'm sure from an employer's perspective, Lesley, there's a number of things that keep you awake at night in respect to drink and drugs.
Amongst other things.
Amongst other things. And last but not no means least, myself, Andrew Drewary, I'm a collision investigator by trade, have been for 20 years. During that time, investigated over 40,000 collisions or been involved in the investigation process, but analysis of those investigations and the information we get from drivers is surprising how often drink and drugs come into the equation when the right questions are asked to the individuals involved in collisions and crashes after they've happened. So the investigation process sort of stress tests policies, which obviously Ian will talk about from a drug and alcohol policy going forward. But once we identify the issues, then it gives us a basis to update our policies and work with people like Lesley and Ian to improve fleet culture and driver culture when they're out on the road. And particularly what's happened over the last 12 months, 15 months with the pandemic. I think you'll be surprised with some of the facts and figures that we put forward today to how much drink and alcohol driving has sort of increased over that time. So to start the session today, I'm going to take the first 10 or 15 minutes to look at the background of drink and drug driving and the main reasons to why we need to identify, educate and support drivers to protect your fleet. And I think, Ian, just a quick question here for you. I think it's that issue of identify, educate and support that is paramount at this stage.
Most definitely. We're way beyond the situation of burying your head in the sand and not looking. The drug problem, especially post-COVID, is so specific, so damaging and prolific that you really do need to start looking, find out who your problems are, and a big part of that is education and having the policy on which you base everything. So all in all, it's to protect your fleet, it's to protect your employees, your drivers, and to protect yourselves.
I think most importantly for people to realise is that very few people go out on the road to actually cause a crash, but I think if we do something that sort of aggravates that feature and we make it, somebody makes a choice to take alcohol or drugs before they get behind the wheel, they've made a choice to obviously potentially impair themselves from driving, which could come back onto the employer. And I think one of the things we will raise today is where the employer sits within this process as well, to how much they should investigate as well. So we'll bring you into that as well, Lesley, as we go forward. But I think one of the things that Ian's touched on already, and Ian is obviously the main expert in respect of understanding the drugs and that, and we need to learn about what the effects of the drugs are and what the telltale signs are for our drivers. And not just for our drivers, as managers, for those of us who are managers here today, it's not all about the driver's responsibility. The managers have a massive issue to deal with here and need to know the telltale signs and what to look out for. And that is the same with taking the drugs and the effects on the driving ability, and things that are out there from telematics that can help potentially identify or raise a question about whether somebody has taken any drugs. So we'll touch on that in a bit more, but I think we're looking at the 3 different types of drugs that can affect driving today. And first off, we have the stimulants, and these are the drugs that speed up the process from the central nervous system. And amphetamines are the group of drugs that increase the activity of certain chemicals in the brain. And some of these things today are a bit technical, but I think if we try and put them into layman's terms, I think from a stimulant drug, Ian, I think if things are speeded up, everybody thinks things are happening a lot slower around them, so that we can start driving a bit quicker. Would you say that's sort of an issue?
Yes, and with that you lose the sense of risk, and in effect you are becoming more risky. You out of those 3, the amphetamines, the main one that's seen in this country is ecstasy, MDMA, different names, different mixes. But the principal one we see in the workplace is cocaine. It is almost as common as cannabis nowadays. Mm-hmm. And people take it to feel better, think they're more reacting better. They may be down in the first place, thinking they need something to stimulate them, whereas actually they're causing themselves much more problems and creating a bigger risk for yourselves.
So it's all that word risk, you used it 3 or 4 times there in that sort of summary, and I think that highlights the whole thing altogether, the whole situation with drink and drugs. It's the risk, and people prepared to take that extra risk when they're behind the wheel. And we've touched on some of the names there. I think some of the other names that we'll be aware of are ice, speed, crystal meth, uppers, whiz, whatever they are, we need to know what their effects are. And I think, again, education is not just the driver's perspective, it's the managers. If the managers see the changes in attitude and performance, then they need to be aware of these things and start looking at ways of asking the awkward questions. So Ian's highlighted some stuff there, but on the screen now we've got the additional things to look out for. Attention difficulties, increase in speeding, aggressive and dangerous driving. We've touched on risk and overconfidence in driving skills. Lesley, just bring you in here. Do you see much of a change looking at the telematics in driver performance, and that things raise your eyebrows?
We haven't linked it to drink and drugs, but obviously we do look at the telematic system, we do look at driving styles, and we do, obviously we link that to our accidents. So you can tell the drivers have got a more aggressive driving style, harsh braking. They're the ones that are going to have more accidents. Following an accident, we will be testing, and it's at that point, obviously, we will know if there have been drugs and alcohol involved.
Yeah, and I think it's looking out for the telltale signs that how these drugs are taken in as well, because we've got injection or snorting, and whether people notice staff doing things before they go out on the road that should make them aware of whether to ask a question or not, or challenge an employee.
That's I think the word challenge is possibly where we have a slight problem. If you have a system in place in the first place, then these challenge situations are going to occur much fewer. Really, in the same way that you might use a breathalyzer, it's a yes or no. Is this present? Is it not? It's not a subjective opinion that you might have when you go, should I challenge this driver because there's something odd happening? If you were to use a testing system, a screening system, it will give you a yes/no answer. Have I got a problem in this situation? Now, in quite a few cases, it's going to be, I don't have a problem. So you're then looking into something else with the telematics, and it might be a training issue, a familiarity with that particular vehicle or that bus route. But it's one of these things that gives you information, and that's what you need to do. And you need to create the deterrent. It keeps the innocent majority protected, but it finds the not so innocent minority.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's the thing, it's not being afraid to ask those questions, and once you've sort of identified a potential issue, it needs to be tackled. We can't just ignore it. And if we touch on the next slide with the depressant drugs, and I think during COVID, these are probably some of the drugs that most people have probably relied on or fallen into using a little bit more. And with people working from home, sat behind the desk, may have a glass of wine during the day or a drink of beer, and then forgetting that they've got a meeting to go out to or go back to the office for something, because it's become a bit more of a routine. So I think the policies that we talk about later, Ian, are vital to say how we deal with those problems coming back into the workplace now as the world is opening up again. But as Ian said before, the other drugs, before speed things up, these drugs slow things down and make everything around us appear to be moving a lot slower. It makes us relaxed. We have the issue of reducing the central nervous system to take the anxiety away. And I think opioids, obviously, probably the major issue around the world for us. So I think if we look at these things here, where the different areas that they grow in, but other common names for heroin include Big H, horse, hell dust, and smack. Ian, any other names we want to add to that list at all that people should be aware of?
There's probably a lot more slang. I think the biggest thing with heroin is you do see them managing to hold down an employment role, but an awful lot of them will have sold anything and everything to carry on with their heroin use. It's very rare that they manage to show up to work. Your biggest issue in that list you've got there is definitely alcohol, and then the next one is cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
And they always seem to think that cannabis use, so it doesn't affect anybody. Well, there's plenty of studies out there that show that it will stop you reacting for 3, 4, 5 days, reacting to the same level you would if you hadn't taken the cannabis.
Yeah.
And then there's mixing alcohol and cannabis together. It doubles the impairment effect.
Yeah, and I think from an investigator's perspective, and when I'm interviewing people, it's amazing and quite frightening how many people do mix. That those two things do come together quite often, and seems to be more so in some of the incidents I've been looking at in the last 12 to 15 months. I think when we look at the issues things that we need to be looking out for from a management perspective: reduction in concentration, difficulty processing information, difficulty multitasking, drowsiness, fatigue. I think fatigue now in this day and age is a common issue for people driving, and I think those with commercial vehicle fleets, Lesley, I think the driver shortage doesn't help these things, and we're probably asking more and more of drivers to take a bit more on.
Well, we are, and of course there's all this discussion of relaxing drivers' hours in order that we can continue to serve the supermarkets and the production chain because of the shortage. And I am absolutely, totally against that. Drivers' hours are there for health and safety reasons, and for me, they should absolutely not be extended. But because there's a driver shortage, the additional risk is, you are reliant on agency drivers. Drivers are jumping ship simply to go to another operator that's paying a few pounds more. You're getting in agency drivers, and the quality just is not as good. You just don't know what you're going to get. So, and there's a problem there, are we testing all our agency drivers? Dare we test all our agency drivers?
And I think that is a question people around the table today need to think about. What is your process for not just your own staff, but staff that you have coming in on an ad hoc basis or a periodic basis, and what you identify? A lot of people are fatigued in the morning anyway, but what has made in that process? Have they taken drugs to try and fight that fatigue and give them a bit of energy? But when we look at those two drug sections that we looked at the minute, one increasing speed and one slowing down speed of what we do, that's where the telematics comes into it. I think, does a driver drive differently on the first day of a shift to any other day? May identify a potential issue. But it just helps that the technology is there just to see and assist and raise those questions for people. So I think understanding these issues, and as Lesley said, the driver agency drivers are a big issue in that respect, that we have to manage it in a slightly different way. And then we come to the hallucinogenic drugs. So again, most common names on the screen for you. And distort a person's perception of reality. So imagine that type of person taking those drugs, getting behind the wheel of a vehicle, and the effects that they will have on their driving ability. So we've got hallucinations, altered perceptions of speed again, confused thinking, blurred vision, reduced coordination. I think those last two, Ian, are quite frightening in particular for the effects and getting behind the wheel.
Most definitely. Any of those, I mean, just to put it into perspective, ketamine is a horse tranquilizer. They don't use it on humans because it's too heavy. LSD, yes, it's there in small amounts, and various magic mushrooms are out there. Yeah, it's this whole idea of taking hallucinogenics. People wouldn't pay the money for these drugs if it didn't affect them. And those effects are what give you, running a company, the problems and the risks.
Yeah, I think we've got a question, or sort of more of a statement from one of the delegates today. Is again, it's that issue of prevention is better than the cure, or the testing itself, and it comes down to that education process that we said at the beginning. How good a weekend has somebody had if they're showing these sorts of signs that we've highlighted on the screen so far? So it's all about making sure we know what to look out for, but the potential consequences from an investigation perspective, when we're looking at these things, personal, a lot of drivers don't always think about the personal consequences that are going to come their way, obviously because of the effect maybe of the drug that they're taking at the time, because it's affected their judgment before they've got into the vehicle. But the least of the worries are probably prosecution, fine and points and a ban. Then we have imprisonment, disciplinary process, loss of job. There's all these different things here, but I think for most people at the end it's relationship issues, financial, and I think the big one, how many people do walk away and think after it's happened and they can live with the consequences of what they've done, if it is a catastrophic or a fatal crash or collision. And that is one of the biggest questions I ask people as part of an investigation, is if they could go back 10 seconds before they had that fatal crash with somebody, what would they say to the person in the other car to explain to them why they were driving the way they were driving, or they got in the car because they'd had a drink, or they got in the car because they'd been under the influence of drink or drugs. So I think it's one of those things that once people are asked that question directly, it changes. But sometimes I think started doing some training processes with people now to ask those questions before any drivers are involved in a crash, because it's an awkward question to ask and answer at the best of times, even without it being a reactive measure. So I think moving forward then, for the business consequences, Lesley, all of these would be your worst nightmare if one of these things, one of your drivers was involved in a catastrophic incident and any of these issues came your way.
Of course, it's not just, it's the company reputation, it's the company brand, it's the cost implication. Insurance is high as it is, but have a fatality or a major incident on the road, your insurance could just go sky high. And thinking of the majority of operators are small operators with 20 vehicles or less, working on margins of less than 3% net margin. You know, a hike in insurance means actually they go out of business. So we've got to do everything to prevent that.
Okay, I'm conscious of time and I'm just about running on time to the end of my session. So we've got the 3 questions here that employers need to ask themselves, all about identifying, educating and supporting their staff, and they're quite clear on the screen. Do we have measures? Are we doing enough? And what can we do better? And Ian will go through that shortly on his section. And some of the common physical signs. The copy of the slides will be going out to everybody, I think, and the webinar is being recorded. We don't need to go through them all. We've touched on some of these already. So let's keep an eye out for these things. And I think also, over the last 12, 15 months, prescription medication has become a bigger issue, and over-the-counter medication. Let's be aware of what the potential consequences and effects of these medications have. Anybody on prescription medication obviously needs to tell their employer. You need to find out as an employer what they're taking, but they also need to carry a copy of their prescription with them whilst they're driving in the UK in particular. So I think that's just a really light touch session onto the identifying signs, and that's the end of my session. We've only had that sort of one question come through so far, Ian and Lesley. So I think, given the time, we'll move straight on to you, Ian, and tackling the drug driving.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, title says it all. Why this subject and why now? Half my business is workplace, and the other half is supplying each and every one of the police forces in England, Wales and Scotland with their roadside drug testing equipment. So I'm in a bit of a novel situation that I can see the amount of drug driving being detected quite literally day by day, week by week, month by month. And so from that, I can collate quite a few data sets, and just a couple of interesting ones to highlight to you. We're looking here on this slide at this recent December drink drug drive, so the pre-Christmas and New Year period. And we're looking at three example forces, Cleveland, Cumbria and Gwent. And we're looking at the drug drive figures being 2 to 3 times more than the drink drive. Now, everybody out there accepts that drink drive is no longer socially acceptable. In fact, it's downright dangerous. What we have to get the message across is that drug driving is just as bad, and it is now more prolific. So I did mention there is no longer a place to keep your head buried in the sand. The problem is there, and you have a duty to look for it. So moving on, just to reinforce those figures and how things have moved on, 2019 for the full year, Essex went through with 1,800 drug drives versus only 1,400 drink drives. West Yorkshire was slightly the opposite way, but very active, still having nearly 2,000 drug drives, and as I say, being very active on their drink drive activities. Merseyside actually had the most drug drive arrests of over 2,000 in that year alone. At the same time, also having a record drink drive statistics. So that was quite phenomenal figures there from Merseyside. If we move to the first half year of 2020, we'll see that Essex is now 1,300 in the half year. We'll see that West Yorkshire is 1,200 in the half year, and Merseyside 1,100 in the half year. Each one of those is getting bigger and bigger. The bottom, this is the bit that transfers between the police figures and the workplace. 50% of Merseyside's drug drive arrests were driving at work or drove for work. Half of the people. Now that was not targeted. That was just their officers, their road traffic police, seeing bad driving, stopping the driver, finding drug driving. Now, I find that those two slides and those figures quite shocking personally, and that's why I say we have to highlight this is the situation we're in now.
Yeah, I think I'm conscious to keep on time and that, and we've got the question coming up. But just on those figures alone, it'd just be interesting to ask Lesley a quick question, and a short answer, Lesley. If 50% of your drivers failed to test at work today, what's the effect on the business?
I don't even want to go there. My fleet would be standing, and just because I'm not paying for drivers doesn't mean that I'm not paying for my vehicles, I'm not paying for my maintenance, I'm not paying for my insurance. It would just be absolutely catastrophic. And every time I see Ian's presentation, I always get a little bit tense. It's frightening statistics, but I can say as well, from delivering driver CPC training on drugs and alcohol, and my trainer coming back to me, these are open courses, not all my drivers, but saying at the break, most of the questions are coming up about drugs.
Yeah.
They're not asking questions about drink, it's about drugs, which just kind of echoes what Ian is saying here.
Yeah, and we'll come on to a question while the audience and the delegates are going to answer the poll question that which come up next. So for everybody, just before I launch the actual voting slides, I'd like you all to engage in this question to give us some feedback and your stance at the minute. So as employees start to return to the workplace, have you implemented extra support and education surrounding the dangers of drug and alcohol misuse? So we've got three answers for you. Very straightforward on the screen for you now. Yes, no, we need further support. And if everybody can answer that over the next few seconds, I'll ask one question for Ian to answer that's come through. Ian, we've had a question that's come through about we've talked about the speeding up and slowing down. Compared to alcohol, which affects everybody in the same way in this question, how do you identify cannabis impairment and deal with it when the effects can be so different?
Alcohol, you can invariably smell, and people are slurred and slowed down. Cannabis is similar, and you can invariably smell that as well. Yeah. It's quite different. Okay. But they're both dangerous, and together, even just half a pint with one spliff will take you more than double the impaired level. So in both cases, you're going to see physical impairment. You're going to see here mental impairment. Yeah.
Oh, okay, so we've got the results on the screen there. I think that's really interesting that a third have, more or less a third, an equal split here right across the board, that a third have implemented extra processes in, and 2/3 no or not sure and they need further support. So I think that's a probably quite common with everything we've discussed so far in other sessions, and thank you for the almost 70% of people who voted on that question. One of the questions have come in as well, which you're going to cover really, Ian, as we go forward, but I'll just make sure we highlight it as we go through the next few slides. So businesses are not immune.
No, businesses aren't immune. Statistics show that last year, 1 in 8 under 35s were using cannabis. And here's the shocking one. 1 in 14 of all employees were using cannabis too. So here's the question. Do you know who the drug users are within your workplace? That's the key. And just carrying on, we're needing to see now, we're in a different situation where we will be in a couple of weeks with more people coming back to work from furlough. As people are coming out of this period of having been stressed from working at home and maybe furloughed, lack of salaries, different working conditions, how have they handled that stress? Has it been extra alcohol? Well, we already know 25% of the population is drinking more. We know 25% of the population who take drugs are taking more. So it makes it even more imperative that we find out who these people are, remove them from your problem, which is the risk in your company. Okay. And the break, we need to be removing them from the road completely. We need to be taking that bigger responsibility.
You're right, and I think this session is so focused on helping people identify and giving some of the solutions. Someone's asked a specific question, which I think I'll come to after this slide, Ian, because of the different demographics of employee.
Yeah, this is just 3 we picked up. We weren't just going for bald guys. They're just shocking. And they could easily be driving any of your vehicles or your grey fleet. You know, we've got Wayne, the lorry driver, who was taking heroin and crack cocaine, common mix for heroin users, fell asleep at the wheel, crashed and killed 2 people. He's in jail. Then we have Iona, who was driving with his housemate in the car. who you can see the passenger seat on that car. It doesn't exist anymore, and neither does his housemate. And then we've got Luke, the proverbial white van man. He was jailed for killing the 2 girls that were in the back of a car. Both parents were injured. Again, he fell asleep at the wheel, having, I know some particulars on this case. He'd been out partying, taking alcohol and numerous drugs. He'd then gone into work. He'd driven quite a long way. I think the party was in somewhere like Leeds. He'd gone down to London and was returning from a job in London, was coming up through Cambridgeshire, fell asleep. He'd been using cocaine to try and stay awake after having had a complete excess the night before. So these are the people that are out there. This is happening. What we hear from our police colleagues is that they will look for cars. They look for people who have messy lives, have problems like this. So they're looking for messy dashboards scattered with rubbish. Just people that are not organised and not on top of it. Any of these little things starts to add up, so that they go back to your list of a couple of slides ago, Andrew. It's a general awareness of, am I happy with this particular person? And so having a regular system means that they will be being tested, they will be being reviewed, but you can then bring up a with cause. There's a situation here that I'm thinking there's something going on. I need to explore that. Am I going to check for alcohol? Am I going to check for drugs? We might isolate both those things and we start looking at other issues. Might be personal life, might be stress, might be well-being issues. But either way, there's something we need to take off the road.
Okay. Good analogies and summaries of all of those. And as before we touch on this brief slide here, and I think I'll bring Lesley in for this question that's come in. Lesley, someone suggested we've already provided some great ideas, but how do you proactively manage in an increasingly remote working environment because of post-pandemic? So I think probably for a fleet operator like yourself, remote environment's not that rare, but for a lot of employers, it has become rare. It's been a challenge over the last 15 months. So just briefly, how can we implement a better remote process to manage the staff?
Yeah, it's all about knowing your staff, isn't it? And you say it's kind of normal for to have remote workforce with regard to drivers, but it's not normal with regard to your office staff. And that's what I've encountered, that as my office staff have been working from home, they most definitely have encountered challenges and different challenges. Yes, some have been drinking more, some have been a bit paranoid about coming back to work. And it's recognizing issues, recognizing that people are stressed, listening to what they're saying, and they're drinking a little bit more. In the office, have been the eyes and ears when drivers come back after being away all week. If they're talking about their family, or if they come into work in the morning and said, "Oh, I had a skinful at the weekend." Well, hang on a minute, what day is it? Is that still in the system? Because if drivers who were drinking a lot on Saturday night following the football, if they were drinking till excess, they actually could have still been impaired on Monday morning. So it's having the policies, but the real basics for me is being like an antennae, looking, listening, making sure your management team also know how to look for the vital things. So you will know that, yes, it's great to have policies, but if policies just sit on the shelf, it's absolutely no good. It's living those policies, and for me, being the eyes and ears, and having an open culture where people dare come forward and talk to you. And if they daren't talk to me or some of the other managers, they dare talk to someone else, and not having a blame culture either, looking at the root issues.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing. And I think, Ian, we touched with this slide, we know there's a little bit of background, but we touched on some of the consequences for the employer before, and why do we have a policy? Because of health and safety legislation that we need to, in the workplace, that we need to adhere to and look after, and the potential issues of corporate manslaughter and gross negligence manslaughter. So I suppose that brings us nicely onto protecting you and your employees on this slide, really.
Yeah, it's being no doubt that being directors of companies, you have legal obligations and responsibilities, and there are consequences for not doing some of these things. At the end of the day, we work on a principle that is policy, educate, deter, then detect. So we need to start with the policy. And you must have one, whether it's short or long. It needs to be there. Now, I prefer ones that are effective, and that means that the employee can read it and understand why I'm expected not to drink till 2 o'clock in the morning and then turn up at work at 6, and also understand the consequences. If that happens, I'll be found out. I will be detected, I will be through disciplinary and probably lose my job. And so those are the things that you need to be. A policy needs to be effective, shouldn't be open to interpretation. People should get that when they start in the company. And an important thing, many people will take, yes, I've got a policy. I'd like to ask the question, when was the last time you looked at your policy? When was the last time you reviewed it? Have you taken account of the slides that we've just shown over the effects of drugs the past couple of years? So it's not a do it once and walk away. It should be a reviewed, and different things should trigger that review. We also look at the type and the testing of that you can happen. Pre-employment testing keeps the problem out of your company. Random testing keeps a deterrent up and running, that anybody can be tested and caught at any point in time. And then with cause is the one that most people think of. Well, if the accident happens, I'll do something. Well, you need something in place for when the accident happens. Another big thing we come across is 20 years ago, people used to think, oh, well, 10% testing. Do you ever work out what 10% testing, random testing is? That's effectively being tested once every 10 years. Now, how many people think, having seen those figures, that that's an effective testing system? It isn't. You need to be testing somebody, or that they have the fear of being tested every 2 to 3 years. So that means a 33 to 50% testing regime. Okay. And all of these things we can help you with, but you have to realize that it's a bigger issue now. It's very prevalent. We need up-to-date systems and policies.
So I think really Lesley highlighted it as well previously. Communication is the big issue here. It's all right having the policy, but it needs to be communicated properly, and everybody needs to understand it and be prepared to ask questions if they don't. And I think this stat on the screen comes back to your 50% stat for Merseyside Police, but 74% of substance abusers are in full-time employment. So that is really, really frightening. But I think for me, I think that there's lots of different things there. And when we look at the training programs, Ian, and we look at how we identify and what we do, someone's raised a really good question here in respect of vaping. They said in the US alone, vaping has more than tripped in the past few years. So including vaping cannabis, which produces no smoke or scent. Have we got any information over here in respect of vaping and drug taking?
It's one of these situations about people think it has no smell. People, there's different things going on out there. Our biggest problem is actual, just straightforward alcohol consumption, cannabis consumption, cocaine consumption. and then codeine as a medication in your opiates. So we should just stick to the biggest issue. So we address alcohol, but we're also going to address this massively expanding issue of drugs, and those drugs are cannabis and cocaine. So one of the big things that we want to talk about here is training programs. Now, those training programs, let's just call it education. It's talking about bringing managers up to understanding what the problems are, directors able to understand why they need to do this and put some resource behind it, managers so that they're capable, and then employees so that they realize why not to do it in the first place. It comes in that sequence: policy, educate, deter them, and then detect. And CIPD has been very clear that the preventative side is the education, and so it's vital that you get involved in this. I suppose COVID, one of the silver linings is COVID has pushed us, many other companies, into having online training systems, having ones that you can click into at any point in time and sign up to. They're quite painless to go through, but they are all informative.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question, and like we keep going on about education. It's the recurring theme throughout this more than anything else, and I think it is right. It is education. There's a question for Lesley that's coming that we'll deal with on her section, so I'll hold that in abeyance for you, Lesley, when we get to you in a couple of slides, as I'm conscious of time, because there has been a few questions. So Ian, best practice?
Something we've also realised is we know what best practice is. We like to think we are the best specialist supplier, but our customers don't really know what to ask us, what questions, or ask us or anybody in the industry. So how do they know what best practice is? So we've spent the last year or so developing, just taking that particular line. This working again with break is exactly what we're talking about. What is best practice? What questions should you ask any potential supplier? And there's things like, what's your credibility? Well, ours is 26 years, 300 customers, every police force in the country. So that's quite a good answer. What's your capability? We can take on anybody from a tiny SME or micro all the way through to the PLCs that we supply in the supermarkets and the bus companies. Then you get into different sort of systems and the capability of the particular devices that you're using for screening. Where's the dignity in screening the innocent majority, as well as catching that not so innocent minority? So that's where we get into the efficiency as well, the portability. Is it able to be in every place at every time? How reliable is it? Ours is working with the police forces. We probably do 95% of the police testing throughout the world, which I think we have somebody from Australia on. This would be very clued up to them with the drug wipe. We look at other issues about corporate responsibility, and we look at the accountability. So this is what best practice should be when you're talking to a potential supplier. We like to think of us as partners because, as I said, it's not a buy it and walk away. It's an ongoing situation that we feel we need to look at. We need to advise our partners as we go forward.
Okay. So like I say, everything is there on the screen for people. As you said, there are other providers out there, but these are the questions people should ask those providers in the first place, and not be afraid to do it. So Ian, I thank you for that, and that brings a close to your session. I'm sure you'll come into some of the points that Lesley's going to raise, and we're going to go on to Lesley in a second now. We've got 10, 11 minutes left, Lesley. If we have 5 or 6 minutes going through your slides in particular, but I think in why, who, how, when, the barriers, possibly refer to this question that somebody sent in. So someone's directed this to you, Lesley. Says, I hear your concerns that if 50% of your workforce were tested positive, it would be devastating. I imagine due to the shortages just of one driver who tests positive causes a logistical nightmare, and therefore managers relying on for-cause testing and police enforcement as a way of showing they're addressing the drink drive concerns to keep their business running. So why did you'll probably answer that question with your 5 bullet points there.
Let me go through it. Hopefully I'll answer that question. Don't get me onto the driver shortage because I'll need more than 10 minutes. So yeah, I just want to tell everybody my story with regard to implementing drugs and alcohol testing. And I've split it down to this: why, who, how, when, and the barriers. So why? 3 years ago, maybe a little bit more, I was at a meeting with the DVSA, the Road Haulage Association, and we were talking about safety on the roads with regard to vehicles and maintenance. And we just finished the meeting, and the lady next to me said, well, you know, the real problem is drivers and drugs. And everybody turned around and looked at this lady who had a fleet of 14 vehicles. She was serving the construction industry where testing was mandatory, and she started the testing. She tested 14 of her drivers and 6 were positive. And I was just absolutely aghast. And then the gentleman at the other side of me, who had a massive transport company, said, yeah, 1/3 of mine tested positive. And I thought, oh my goodness, I've never even thought of this. And I started talking about some people in my network, and another person said, oh yeah, we went down that avenue and we were getting an external provider in to do the drugs and alcohol testing, and the night before they were coming in, the director opened the back door of one of the vans, and the guys were in there smoking wacky backy. And I thought, oh my goodness, and they cancelled the testing. So that is why I started to think about it. And if you think that you're paying 90, 100 grand for a truck and the insurance and the maintenance, why wouldn't you invest money in making sure that the guys or girls that get in the truck are safe and protecting your interest? So that is why I started looking at it. And then you've got the question, who? And I divide that into 2. Who am I going to choose? Who am I going to test? So who am I going to choose? And Ian has very much answered that question, because there are loads of companies out there selling drugs and alcohol testing equipment. And they are all fabulous salespeople. And you've got to be very, very careful not to get drawn into that, and ask the questions, you know, who are their clients? How are they going to help you? How will they help you? How will they educate you? What support will they give? For those of you out there who bought a truck, you can go and get the best truck on the market, but if it breaks down on the motorway and there's no one there to help you, then it's no point having that truck. So one of my criteria was I needed to have a system that was a legally defensible system that I could use in court. So that was who I was going to get. They were going to give me training, they were going to support me, and it was going to stand up in court. And then who was I going to test? Well, Ian's mentioned that people were testing 10%, you know, and that might be just doing 1 test a month. And I thought, no, my aim is to test everybody, so that everybody knows that they are going to be tested, and everybody knows that they actually could be tested more than once, because you don't want people to think, oh, it's okay now, I've been tested, I can go out and do whatever they do. So they were my who's. And then of course the difficulty is, how am I going to implement this? So I had a drugs and alcohol policy, but of course that policy had to link in with the system I was using. So obviously you may know I use D.tec. So I asked D.tec to look at my policy, and they came back with some changes. And then I sent that to my legal people and said, is this going to stand up? I may have a system that's going to stand up. But if my policy doesn't link into that system, then that's no good. So we started off there with the policy.
Lesley, just sorry to, I'm just conscious of time because we are strict on time. So we've got 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Okay. Link into my disciplinary system and my rules and regulations. Then I had to train my team, train the team to deliver this. And again, was the provider going to help me? Then I'm going to communicate it. I'm going to communicate it to my workforce, and I'm going to give them the heads up. I'm going to start implementing this in a month's time. That was the interesting bit, because then I got resignations even before I started using the policy. Put it into my driver's manual, include it in my contracts of employment, so everybody knows, include it in my agency agreements. Then the when am I going to test? I'm going to test prior to employment. I'm going to do the random testing. I'm going to do for cause. I'm going to test after the football match on Wednesday evening, on Thursday morning when the people come to work. The barriers, I could have no workforce. I could have no workforce if they all test positive. But actually, if they go out there and cause an incident, I'm not going to have a company. And I like to sleep at night. Talking about fatigue, you know, if I'm awake, then that's going to cause me more stress. So there is a massive risk, but the risk if I don't do it is a fatality, a major incident, corporate manslaughter, weigh that up against no employees, and word gets round. Doesn't word get round that work for Freightlink Europe, because they're going to make sure you're compliant and they're going to look after you, and that is what I'm aiming to get. And you've got 3 minutes.
Thank you, Lesley. And you certainly answered the question that was here about corporate manslaughter to a certain degree in that. I know we've got a couple of minutes left, and we've got a couple of questions that I think we do need to address quickly. First one, Ian. You'll have 30 seconds to 45 seconds to do this, so I'll cut you off if you overrun. Decriminalisation of certain drugs, especially cannabis. What type of impact does this have on fleets?
It makes no difference. Decriminalisation of consumption of cannabis is one thing. The Road Traffic Act is another. So is corporate manslaughter and many other parts of the legislation. It is, do you drink and smoke on a school night? No, you don't, because your job is to be a responsible in this situation, driver of a bus, driver of a HGV, driver of a white van. There's no question. Okay,
so that's nice and short and sharp. Lesley, 45 seconds for you on this one. Clock will be running. So the issue of for fleets of a driver being dismissed from one company for drug use, then go to another company and get a job literally the next day. And we know on the driver shortage, so keep off the driver shortage because companies can't share that info. So we're talking of privacy laws and data protection. How big an issue is this in the UK?
It's a massive issue for that driver that goes. You know, I don't know why he's gone, and of course he is going to go to another employer. For those, if I found one guilty, impaired, I would be advising the traffic commissioner. No different to if I found someone driving with using a phone at the wheel. Yeah, real danger.
Okay, so thank you both for your input today. Really good discussion session. I hope people out there have enjoyed listening to the three of us go on for 59 minutes now. I'm going to hand back over to Break to do a final sum up. Adam.
Great, thank you, Andrew, Ian and Lesley for all your help with today's webinar, and of course thanks to D.tec for sponsoring this event. We hope everyone who's attended today has found the webinar informative and engaging, and has taken home some information we can all use to work towards our shared goal of safe and healthy mobility in fleets. If any of you would like to continue the conversations we've had in today's event, you can do so on our Global Fleet Champions LinkedIn page and on our Twitter page as well. As Andrew mentioned earlier, I believe the full recording for today's event will be published online on YouTube and on the Global Fleet Champions website in the next couple of days, so you can view the full recording there as well. If anyone is interested in attending future Global Fleet Champions event, On September the 28th, we are running a webinar on community outreach. And on the 30th of November, there is a webinar about vehicle procurement and maintenance. Another thank you to today's speakers and to our sponsor. The webinar will now conclude.